SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the course An Introduction to Disability Studies. In this lecture number 18, I am going to speak about Indian literature and disability. So before we talk about Indian literature and disability, let me go back and talk about what we discussed in the previous lecture that was based on identity, politics and disability. Let me give you a quick summary of that lecture called Identity, Politics and Disability. First, because of post-structuralism and postmodernism, everywhere people started talking about identity, right. As I discussed in the previous lecture, that identity is something that makes you feel part of the community or the group, because you share your experiences, you feel that I belong to that particular identity. And identity is also something that is generated, that is created in difference of some other identities. Let us say for example, when you say I am a man, you basically are saying that I am not a woman. So in difference of a woman or femininity, masculine identity is created. All right. So that is why what happened, that after the post-structuralism and postmodernism, everyone everywhere started talking about identity. But our job of previous lecture was to look at what are the problem it can create by talking about identity politics, right. What is the politics of creating identity? What is the politics of saying that you belong to that identity, or that is what identity is about, right. So there are people who have a problem with this, because they think that if this politics will take place constantly, then the real concern of disabled people go in the background. What does that mean? It means that if we are going to constantly say that there is nothing wrong with the body, everything is wrong with the society. So what about the experiences of people with disability? Where will they go and where will they talk about their experiences? That's a one problem. The second problem is, the moment you create an identity, now it is a pressure on everyone to conform to that identity. And if you fail to conform, again the normative structure, which means then you will not become a part of that identity, even if you think that I belong to that identity. So because of that conformity, as you all know, it will lead to, yes, coercion. That is the second problem that we have. Identity politics, and as Tobin Siebers are also arguing, that identity politics has the potentiality to talk about narcissism as well. Identity politics and narcissism go hand in hand. If identity politics and narcissism go hand in hand, they both will collude with ableism. And as we all know, the notion of ableism is against the discourse of disability, right. So these are the important problem that we see. And also Susan Wendell like people are arguing that identity politics will not speak against capitalism. But if we are talking about disability studies, we have to go against the notion of capitalism as well. along with these discourses, Marx comes into the picture. And Marx has written a very beautiful book called On the Jewish Question. As I was talking about, that we all must read that book to understand that. On the Jewish Question is talking about how class is a one important phenomena which has a potentiality to challenge inequality. But if you keep talking about identity politics, where would the class will come? How will class will figure over there? And that would lead again the problem for people with disability. Political inequality will not be challenged, right? So, there are many important notions that we discussed in the previous lecture when we were talking about identity politics and disability. And also you noticed that I spoke about many theoreticians who are speaking about identity politics and disability. Let us say Susan Wendell, Rosemary Garland Thompson, Foucault, Marx, Davis, right? Seldrick, David T. Mitchell and Sharon L. Snyder, they all in fact claiming disability by Simi Linton. So, they all are associated with disability studies and they all talk against identity politics, or they all are talking something which may challenge the discourse, which may challenge the rights, or that does not concern with people with disability, right. So, that is why we need to read these people so that we can understand the arguments associated with identity politics and disability, all right. So, with this let me move to the next lecture, that is called Indian Literature and Disability, right. So, as you saw that I have been talking about the problem associated with disability in Indian discourse. I already touched upon the movements that we have, or movement the way it started to create awareness about people with disability, right. I also talked about certain acts which directly concern people with disabilities, right. So, these are the previous few discourses which are surrounding with Indian context. But today I am going to talk about literature, right, because the previous lecture also covered how disability has been understood in Indian history, which means to say that how disability existed in ancient times, medieval times and modern times, all right. So, with this I am coming to talk about today Indian literature and disability, right. Let me first start with the very pretty notion of what is a literature about, because it is very important to understand, because most of our students fail to understand what literature is all about. People generally think that literature is a mirror of society, right. I mean, I am sure that most of us think like the same, that literature is a mirror of a society. But you will not believe that René Wellek like thinkers have challenged this notion. In fact, Terry Gallatin in his book Literary Theory and Introduction, he goes against this definition that literature is a mirror of a society. Now, let us look at why does he say so. Because he does not look at a literature as if it is talking about mirroring the society, rather it projects the society, it represents the society, it talks about the society, right. Now, there are certain questions he asks in his introduction called Literary Theory Introduction. In that literary theory introduction, he speaks about that literature speaks what it finds suitable for itself. Let me make it more clear so that we can easily understand what it means. Don't you think that literature is written from a certain perspectives? And if it is written with a certain perspective and certain point of view, how it can represent or how it can mirror society. I go to the extent to say that even newspaper fail to do so. And if literature mirror the society, what is the job of the newspaper then? Because newspaper factually mirror the society, right? It gives the date, it gives the event, it gives more ideas. So, this very notion that literature is a mirror of society is a problematic. It is problematic, and we understand this before we venture into literature and disability. Because what would happen, all the prejudiced and biased representation of people with disability will be taken and understood as if it mirrors the society. Because if you recall the previous lectures, I was also talking about that how many books are produced with ableist assumptions. You will not find on the front page any disabled people projected, or most of you in NCERT book previously I have gone through and I have seen that not even a one disabled character is projected as if he is part of the society. There are always an able girl or an able boy who communicate or who speak to each other. In fact, to show the diversity, I have seen that NCERT picks up a Muslim, picks up a Sikh people, picks up people from other communities, Hindu and all that, but it failed to understand that disability is also part of the society and they ignore. Because when we think of disabled people, we think that they are negligent, they are negligible. There are very less people, so let us not count about it who speaks about them. But in terms of true inclusivity, right, even one person, even if he is different, must be included to show that we believe in inclusion. All right. So, but if we believe that literature is a mirror of society, then what would happen, that we are going to believe all the prejudice assumption behind the representation of people with disability in the literature, right? Or we are going to believe all the interpretations done by the authors about people with disabilities in literature. And don't you think that's a stupid and that's a being very wrong way to look at literature? And that is why in this first lecture I am challenging this notion that literature is a mirror of a society. Because it's important to question this notion, to understand disability in different perspectives. Holistical viewpoints can only come when we are letting other perspective to enter. But the moment you say that no, you cannot question the author, you have to follow what author says, then what about the text that it speaks for itself, and what about the reader interpretation? So, there was a time, there have been a time when literature was mainly author centric, right, which means to say that job of a people to read literature as it is projected, represented, spoken, understood by the author, right, which means to say that we are only looking at the meaning which author wants to speak to us. But that is wrong, because I. Richards, like people, challenged this author-centric approach and made it a text-centric approach. You remember practical criticism, right? So, if you all have read new critiques, you will realize and you will understood that they all are speaking against author-centric approach. Now comes text-centric. And it does not stop here only, it also goes to the reader-centric approach, which means to say that it depends on the reader. Now, let me give you an example now. Imagine there is a literature produced, there is a disabled character over there, and if it is read by people with disability, how would he interpret that character? Will he be able to identify with that character? Will he be able to think that he or the character which is represented are like a disabled character? I think that you understood what I am hinting towards. You will see, no, there is a problem with that kind of representation which speaks about people with disability with ableist assumptions. People with disability, when they are going to read that kind of a literature where disability character are represented, they will have a problem, right? Because that is not what disabled people are. That is not what disabled people share that experience, right? So, this is what I am debunking this notion before I am getting into the lecture called literature and disability. Even if you have recalled and if you have understood or if you have seen vast amount of literature which I am presuming that you have read, you will hardly find disabled character as a protagonist in any literary parts. I am not saying the current one, I am saying talking about the previous one and see that. And even if you see hardly there is a protagonist who are disabled in a particular literature produced in even in English or in Hindi or any region or languages, because I come from India, I have tried to look most of the languages to see how disabled characters are represented. It's very sad that we don't see novels depicting disabled people, because one of my students is doing research on Bengali novels and short stories, and I know or we know how it was how much struggle we had in identifying people with disability as a protagonist. Forget about the protagonist, even as a minor characters. One of my students is also doing research on disability studies, and he is looking at short stories written in Hindis, right, written in Hindi. You will not believe that how much struggle we put to find that there are certain amount of literature available that talks about people. There are very less amount of literature produced which speak about people with disability. Or with my limited understanding, if I am saying that, okay, let us say for example that whether I do not know, I have not understood, maybe I have not come across, or maybe I have not read, right. But why they are so invisible, why they are not visible? The question that I am raising, that why are they not in the mainstream, why not they are available in certain curriculum or syllabi of universities? Why is it so that one has to struggle to find disabled character in literature? That is a question that I have. You remember, I was making this claim that most of the time disabled awareness is not available in academic culture. However, there are people who are speaking about disability in the civic culture. So, you see how much academic gap we have when it comes to disability studies, right. I myself have done or produced a thesis on disability studies. I know about that how disabled characters are represented. Let us come back to this point again. Even if you see that they are represented, they would be see that they are represented as a metaphor, which means to say they are there to serve the plot. What is the plot? How stories or incidents are linked to convey certain meaning or ideas. So, you will not find that there are many literature produced where disabled character are as an important character, but they are used as a metaphor, as a trope, as a vehicle to talk about people with disabilities, or the concerns of disabilities are almost missing from a corpus of work produced by people who belong to literature department. That is one idea, right. Second thing, we also notice that most of the time when we see and find disabled character, we tend to ignore them. We tend to ignore them because we are reading from the author-centric approach and we realize that they are not important for us, because even author has ignored them. When author has not given due importance that a one character feel for it. So, they are also ignored, and then because of the pedagogy, the way it is being taught to us, you also see that they are not going to ask any question in the exam. Teacher is not even going to focus on those characters in classrooms, and obviously it will lead to ignore. Their character will be ignored. They will not be read, they will not be understood, they will not be taken into the consideration. You got my point? So, I am not raising only question on literature like that, how the representation of disabled characters are missing in literature. I am also raising a concern that why is it so that even in the classroom these characters are not discussed, if we have any. Why is it so that we are not going to ask any questions in exam on the basis of these characters? You got my point, right? So, these are the important and significant questions that we need to raise before we get into literature and disability. We are going to read literature and disability with this pretty notion that one, that literature does not mirror the society. It talks only about what author has culturally perceived about people with disability, right? It is more about how what author thinks. And if we are looking at the text-centric and reader-centric approach, then obviously we are going to contribute more meaning to the characters associated with disability. You got this point? Right? So, these are the important concerns that I am going to raise. These are the important points that I am going to make in this lecture. This extensive introduction is given to you so that you can understand the nuances linked with literature and disability. With limitation, I would like to make a point that because I have written titled as Indian Literature and Disability, but I have not covered the entire literature from India, because as a research scholar it is not possible for me to explore literature in the entire India, because you see the India is very diverse. But before I go to the slide, I would request you that you must explore by your own self. You go to, you must look at every literature produced in different languages, because I hardly know few languages spoken in India. So, for me it is almost impossible to read about disability in different languages, but it would be my humble attempt, because whenever research scholar come to me, I request them that if they are coming from that particular region, they must explore how disability is represented, interpreted, culturally understood, defined or reconceptualized in their language and culture. So, when I was preparing this course, I was also hinting that I will not only give you what disability is about, but I also give you the point at how you can take this study further, enrich this discipline, right? Because if we come together, we can enrich the discipline, because as we all know, again I am making this point that disability study is not only for people with disability, it is for other marginal identity as well. You got this idea? So, whenever you get time, please explore literature associated with disability in your language as well. That would be an immense contribution in disability studies. All right. So, with this, let us go and see the first slide. Here you see that is the first slide, and there are 4 important points has been made, right. There are 4 important points has been made. They have been made. The first one is, as our understanding of disability and its representation in literature continues to evolve, it is important to explore the concept of disability narrative in Indian narratives. The disability narrative referred to stories and narratives that center around disabled individual and their experiences. These narratives aim to challenge societal norms and stereotypes and provide a platform for disabled individuals to tell their own stories. By shedding a light on the diverse experience of disabled individuals, and disability narrative seeks to promote inclusivity, empathy and understanding. This first point is talking about various perspectives, from the various perspectives. So far I have been talking about that how people with disabilities are represented by authors in literature. But the one question that I am going to speak, which is extremely relevant, think for a second. Have you read a work or a text produced by disabled people? Right? There is a one autobiography is available by Ved Mehta, and now there are many autobiographies available that is written by disabled people, so called disabled people. Now there are stories as well, which is about and by and for people with disabilities. But let us go back to 19th, 17th, 16th centuries, right, even 20th century. Let us go back to the 20th century itself. Now tell me that have you read a work which is produced by disabled people? Or do you know a syllabus of any universities where you see that literature are produced based on disability? Oh, sorry, by disabled people as well, both. Where you are reading a book, you see that teacher comes to the classroom and they are talking about an author, so novel or poem or drama, or you name any narratives which you see that the author is disabled. So far I have not come across, trust me, so far I have not come across one single literary genre which I am going to read, or which is like one work which is part of any literary genre, which I have read in my classrooms or I have taught in the classrooms by people with disabilities. Now the question is, what about their narratives? What about their experiences? Until and unless we take those narratives and experiences into the account, how are we going to challenge the norms and stereotypes? Because so far, whatever literature we are reading is written from someone else's perspectives, right? Don't you think it is important to bring literature people's narratives produced by disabled people as well to counter the narratives, right? So, look at the slide please again. As our understanding of disability and its representation in Indian literature continues to evolve, it is important to explore the concept of disability narrative in Indian literature. The disability narratives, right, what I am talking about, that this narrative is not there. Disability narrative refers to stories and narratives that center around disabled individuals and their experiences. So, there are two, right. One, narratives which are talking about disabled people. Let us say for example, most of the people look at Fireproof by Rajkamal Jha as a disabled narrative, but I see that he is using disability as to talk about as a metaphor. Also there are some issues concerned, but majorly it is not about that. So, the one we need to explore those narratives which is about people with disabilities, and also those narratives which are written by people with disabilities. These two perspectives need to be taken into the account, which are missing. Look at the slide again. These narrative aims to challenge societal norms and stereotypes. and provide a platform for disabled individuals to tell their own stories by shedding light on the diverse experiences of disabled individuals. The disability narrative seeks to promote inclusivity, empathy and understanding. But as you remember in the previous lecture, I have been talking about that inclusivity means what? When we are talking about disability narratives, you all understand that disability narratives cannot be one monolithic or singular. It's going to be very, very diverse. It's going to be differing from one to another because every disabled individuals are different, which means to say physically handicapped people are different from visually impaired people. Visually impaired people are different from hearing impaired person. Hearing impaired people are different from cognitively impaired people. So, you see that disability is not just one simple category, they are many different categories. They all have a different experiences to speak about, to talk about, to say. So, don't you think it's wrong that we think, oh wow, I have included people with disabilities experiences into our syllabus. Now, we are being more inclusive. Obviously, there are limitations on framing the syllabus. I understand that you cannot include, but saying that you have included one stories or one novel by people with disabilities doesn't mean that it speaks for all, because that is a thin line. That is a thin line which we miss. That is a thin line which we tend to ignore. So, my argument what I am making is that we can only promote inclusion and empathy and understanding when we are including the diverse experiences within disability, because understanding can be developed not only by reading one stories or one stories written by one author, but for all, by all. We need to open ourselves, and already if you are not able to do so because of limited period of time, but you must be aware that this is about one set of people, this not is about entire disability. You got this idea, right? So, this is one important point is being made in this slide. Let us go and see the next point in the slide. Here you see the next is ancient Indian texts have significantly influenced how disability is portrayed in Indian literature. They showcase disability through diverse perspective, from mystical powers to societal stigmatization, right? Mystical powers, like as I have been talking about in the previous lecture, I have already outlined. So, I will not go into detail, but I would like to make one simple point is this, that people with disability are interpreted, understood differently in different societies. Depends what culture you belong to, what community you are part of. As you remember, I have been telling you this, that the person who is disabled in one community may not be disabled in another community. The way one culture think about disability may not necessarily another culture thinks the same about the same kind of disability. So, one reason one specific community, one culture may tend to think, right, they may tend to think that people with disability are incarnation of a divine figure, they are divine figure. So, they will be treated as loaded with mystical power. But at the same time, there is another understanding exists where people think that disability is a result of past karma, and they are being punished by getting a birth of disabled. So, their disability is a form of a punishment. Their disability is a form of punishment. So, this is the second way. Due to that understanding, they feel societal stigmatization. However, if you remember, I made this point pretty clear that both are wrong, because both are not talking about inclusion, both are not thinking about inclusion. Both are not around even inclusion. One is talking about a kind of a disability which is considered as a divine being. Mystical powers are attributed to that kind of a body. So, again they are not going to be part of your society. And another obviously thinking that you are so like your body is a form of punishment because you did something very bad in your past life. So, again you will be stigmatized, discriminated in the society. So, you will not be the part of society as well. So, here you see in both ways inclusion is not projected. So, disability is portrayed in Indian literature, but we see there are many interpretations. The one interpretation going to look at disabled people as a divine being, another is going to look at the stigmatized person. So, therefore, when you are reading literature, read in the context, who is representing, why it is being represented like this, what kind of society is talking about, who are other characters aligning with it. Because reading literature is a very arduous task. It is not simply reading the newspaper and memorizing the facts or thinking about the event that happened. It demands your attention. You are not reading a stories, you are basically reading a culture, and reading a culture demands extreme attention and scholarly interpretations, which is only possible when you give your huge attention to that. You got this point, right? So, this is why when you are reading this kind of work, when you are reading this kind of literature, it demands your attention in that. So, why I am talking about all this? Why I am engaging with this kind of argument? I am engaging with this kind of argument so that you can have a fresh perspective when you see this kind of a work, right. You think what I suggested, otherwise what would happen, there would be one simple interpretations, one simple understanding. It will not encompass the diverse experiences. Literature will be reduced, but as we know it is rich, right, and only reader makes a literature rich. If you reduce it, it will not be rich, but if you are going to pay attention and think that there are multiple layers of a meaning there, and remember what Bhaktin was talking about, there are many dialogue are contesting with each other, there are status quo, challenging, hierarchization, being challenged, there are minor characters, they are also speaking. You remember the polyphony and heteroglossy and all these ideas. So, they will speak different about the literature, and that is what our job is when we are engaging with literature in relation to people with disabilities. Let us go to the next point. Sanskrit literature notably presents a mix of inclusion and exclusion of disability, with some text depicting disabled character positively and other perpetuating harmful stereotype. So, classical epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana features character with disability such as Dhritarashtra and Suparkha, whose disabilities shape their experiences and interaction with the narrative. So, I have spoken about Mahabharata and Ramayana in my previous lecture. So, I am not going to talk about this because I highlighted the point that these are must be understood or interpreted in the context. But the point what I am going to make is that Sanskrit literature present a mix of inclusion and exclusion, with some text depicting disabled character positively and other perpetuating harmful stereotypes. So, since I have talked about Mahabharata and Ramayana, I am not going to talk about, but just to give you a hint what I spoke, that every character must be read in the context, and we are not supposed to import the meaning of disability from the West and apply in India or in the East, right. We need to stay away from this kind of methodological problems. We need to know how to interpret, how to read, how to understand something in the context. But also when you see that there are both kind of representation. The one kind of representation that is speak about that positive representation, right. Maybe they are also good human being, they can be good human being, there is nothing wrong with the body, they are misrepresented, they have potentiality to change the public spaces, they belong to public spaces. This kind of a concern which disability studies raises are created by disabled scholars, by certain literature produced in Sanskrit. But at the same time there are other literature produced which is kind of a negative stereotyping of people with disabilities, and that tend to perpetuate harmful stereotypes. So, both we have to read and understand why is it so there, why is it not thing here, how it is being done, who is talking about it, in what context, in what age, in what era, in what relation. And since we have read disability studies, we can come up with a new understanding, new tools to unlock these problems, right. We have got new tools to unlock these problems, unravel these complexities. Maybe we can give a fresh understanding which is not available in our previous times, or the way people have been thinking about those kind of disabled character, we may bring a new fresh perspective, and people may also read that perspective as well, because if those perspectives are missing, people are going to believe the kind of representation, the kind of perspective, kind of interpretation available, because only that kind of narratives are available. So, we need to bring the counter narratives to give the fresh perspectives. All right, look at the slide please. So, over time disability narratives in Indian literature have evolved alongside shift in social, cultural and political landscape. So, modern Indian literature now encompasses diverse perspective on disability, reflecting challenging societal understanding and acceptance. And this is happening now. The new changes, new understanding are coming up. People are now ready to accept diverse narratives. They are ready to listen disability narratives. It's only possible, or it was made possible by disability movements. It was made possible by disability studies scholar, right. So, now you see that there we are in the period of transition. It is not that there is a completely gap, it is not that everything is missing, we have to bring some everything new. But yes, still there are effort to be done, but at least you see that the effort done by thinkers, scholars and movements are getting reflected into realities. There are acceptance for disability narrative as well. There are work produced that is trying to talk about disability in modern times. All right, let us go to the next slide now. So, here we have a renowned author like Arundhati Roy, Amish Tripathi. They have contributed significantly by portraying disabled characters with depth and complexities. They both have challenged stereotypes. However, contemporary Indian literature's portrayal of disability has also sparked discussion around authenticity and the risk of enforcing ableist tropes. So, see, there are two authors I named, one is Amish Tripathi and one is Arundhati Roy. They are talking about disabled characters, right. They are trying to challenge stereotypes. But what need to be also understood, that certain literature are being produced where they are talking about people with disability, but unfortunately they are projecting ableist assumptions while talking about people with disabilities. That is what we must be beware of. When we are reading people with disabilities, interpretations or projections or representation, we must be also concerned, we must be also thoughtful that what if they are being projected with the help of ableist assumption, because that will do more damage. All right, let's go to the slide, please. In modern Indian literature, disability narratives offer a diverse era of experiences, showcasing both challenges and resilience. Renowned authors like Jhumpa Lahiri and Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni skillfully incorporated disability themes in their works. The Lowland by Lahiri explored disability and caregiving within the context of immigration, while Divakaruni's The Palace of Illusions, I am sure that you must have read this work, reinterprets the Mahabharata through the lens of disability and societal expectations. However, these narratives also face criticism for potentially reinforcing stereotypes or overlooking certain disabled communities. Continued dialogue is crucial to ensure greater inclusivity in representing disability in Indian literature. So, in Indian literature, the intersection of disability and gender is pivotal aspect of the narrative, highlighting the unique challenges faced by disabled women. These women, historically marginalized, as depicted as complex individuals breaking societal constraints. Author like Arundhati Roy in An Atlas of the Difficult Word and Anita Desai in Zigzag Way has portrayed disabled women who defy stereotypes, reclaim agency and challenge societal norms. So, here you see there are character produced in these works. For example, we have The Lowland, you remember, by Lahiri, The Palace of Illusion that you have read. Here you see The Zigzag Way, here you see Atlas of Difficult, right. So, see here I have given you certain name of the novels. They are already talking about people with disabilities, but interesting point is this: they all are modern novelist, right. Either you say Arundhati Roy or you say Amish Tripathi, they both are modern novelist. Lowland, The Palace of Illusion, Atlas of Difficult, Zigzag Way, they all are produced in recent times, right. So, I mean, what I am talking about? I am talking about that these characters, disabled characters, were maybe missing or produced as a metaphor, but in modern times, because of the certain movements, certain efforts made by scholars and academicians, awareness created by states and certain schemes and policies, now people are started speaking about disabilities. So, both one way is to talk about, that is resilience, right, making you aware that there are people of different section who exist, and there is another way to look at it. Another way is to look at it is challenging those stereotypes. So, you have to look at the literature when it is produced, what it is doing, right. How are they challenging stereotypes? And as I told you that beware of the ableist assumptions that is hidden on the name of representation of people with disabilities. All right. Now, there is another thing that comes when we read The Zigzag Way by Anita Desai, right. Anita Desai is like Clear Lights of the Day is also very important, right. There the point of disability comes with the lens of gender. You remember I was talking about that disability is very diverse. There are people with disabilities, there are many categories within, like hearing impaired, cognitive impaired, physically challenged, mentally, visually, so on and so forth. In the same, we have gender disability. Not I am talking about that women considered as disabled, but I am talking about women with disability. Trust me, the condition of women with disability is very, very pathetic because of least awareness, because of less sensitization, because of the less policies, because of the less schemes for them, and forget about the literature. I hardly see literature produced that represent women with disabilities, right. So, there is a lack for that as well. All right, think about it. Let us go back to the next slide. So, these narratives illuminate the hurdles disabled women encounter within their families and societies, addressing discrimination and limited access to resources. Yet, they also emphasize their resilience, strength and ability to advocate for themselves. Now, coming to the folk tales and oral tradition, which is also very much part of literature and extremely significant. Indian folk tales and oral tradition have a rich history of integrating disability into their narratives. They offer valuable insights into cultural perception and values surrounding disability. These traditional stories feature a diverse array of characters with disabilities, often highlight their unique skills or power. Through these narratives, important life lessons centered on inclusivity, empathy and understanding are imparted. The impact of cultural storytelling on shaping societal attitudes toward disability is profound. By showcasing disabled individuals as central characters and celebrating their contributions, folk tales and oral tradition promote a sense of belonging and challenge ableist norms. See, my dear students, when I am talking about literature, this is very limited understanding that the only printed novels or poems are part of literature. No. Read Sheldon Pollack. He is talking about what is constituted or considered as a literature. I am not going to talk much on it, but one thing I would say that literature also include autobiography, memoir. It also include folk narratives. It also include interviews, because they all are talking about the experiences. Right. So, the point when I come and talk about in relation to people with disabilities, the interesting notion that is made, and in fact, I invite research scholars and thinkers to think about it, that they should also explore traditional narratives. They should also include Indian folk tales and oral traditions, because Indian folk tales and oral traditions have a potentiality to contribute immensely in discourse of disability studies. But most of the time what happens, we are not going to talk about folk tales and cultural or oral traditions, because remember, oral tradition and Indian folk tales are not which are generated today. They can actually speak how people of that community speak about people with disabilities. So, this is why it is extremely relevant for us to go back and look at Indian folk tales, songs. I am talking about intangible culture. I am talking about stories which are not documented anywhere maybe. I am talking about go and listen to the songs which women sing in marriages or funerals or so on and so forth in different things, right. So, Indian folk tales and cultural traditions must be also explored to understand people with disabilities, right. Let us go to the next slide. A significant evaluation in Indian literature is the rise of disabled author who share their own lived experience and perspective through their writing. The author offer valuable insights into the disability narratives, drawing directly from their personal journeys with disability. Exploring the voices of disabled authors uncover a rich experiences and viewpoints. For example, there is a memoir by Nidhi Goyal, and that is titled as Disability and Sexuality in India. Stories from the Margin boldly delves into the intersection of disability and sexuality, breaking societal taboo and expanding the boundaries of the disability narrative. So, despite facing unique challenges within the publishing industries often marked by lack of inclusivity and accessibility, disabled authors play a vital role in Indian literature. Their contribution promote representation and authenticity in storytelling, providing a platform for disabled people to find themselves reflected in literature. Additionally, they offer invaluable insights into the diverse experience of living with a disability. Indian literature serves as a crucial vehicle for disability advocacy and awareness within society. Through nuanced portrayals of disabled characters, literature confront stereotypes and cultivate understanding and empathy among its readers. So, the one important point that I want to make in these slides, which I have already discussed and talked about, is that even in the publishing, like in the publications, they find tough time to publish their stories and narratives. So, which is why we must talk about that as well. Look at the last slide, please. So, here in the last slide, I am making a point that evolution of disability narratives in Indian literature mirrors shifts in societal attitudes and the tireless efforts of disability advocates. However, achieving accurate and authentic representation remains a challenge. The potential of storytelling lies in its ability to foster inclusivity and empathy, positioning Indian literature to continue driving discourse on disability and challenging ableism. So, reader and critic play a very pivotal roles in shaping the trajectory of disability storytelling. By actively engaging with and endorsing disability narratives, reader can incentivize the publishing industries to prioritize diverse voices and viewpoints, and meanwhile, critics can offer constructive feedback and facilitate discussion aimed at enhancing inclusivity and representation within literature. Right? So, read these slides carefully, but what is the crux of it? That if you really want to promote inclusion, if you really want to bring diverse experiences in literature, we must talk about disability storytelling. We must listen disabled authors and their experiences in a different forms. All right. So, with this, I would end this lecture, and we will see you in this next lecture, where it talks about visuality, films, so on and so forth. So, all right, read, stay happy. Thank you so much for listening to me. Bye bye.